Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 555 for the 11th of Sivan in a regular year. So, we've been talking about existence, and we've been talking about the very fragile nature of existence and how we perceive reality, the reality around us is really not all there is. And the facts that we think that our reality around us, that we perceive reality around us as having its own existence of its own, is actually an illusion. And today we're really going to try to understand this by looking at a very particular form of creation, namely sunlight. And we'll see how sunlight is a really apt parallel for us understanding how it is that the reality that we perceive around us and who we are as creations really has no tangible existence of its own, even though it very much feels to us as if it does. So we're going to begin our discussion today around the topic of the sun and sunlight. So here on Earth, we perceive sunlight as being something very substantial, very real. So it's like if you're in a room and there's light coming in through that room, like let's say if there's none of the lights are on, but there's light coming in the room, that's coming from the sun. Those are rays of sunlight coming in. If you have like stained glass window, then you can see the colors coming through, and that's the rays of the sun coming through. However, if you were to take these same rays of sunlight and you were to shine them back into the sun, which is the origin of these rays of sunlight, we talked about how these rays of sunlight would cease to exist and they would no longer have an independent existence of their because these rays of sunlight originate in the sun. So this is in Hebrew, the term for this is called batel b'mtzius, nullified in its source. And we'll see how all of this is really an analogy for understanding ourselves and God, and how everything in the world comes from God. And really, while to us, it might seem like the world has an independent existence and that we have a very tangible and self-sustaining type of existence, the truth is, God is our origin. So if we were to go back to our origin, then we too, just like the rays of the sunlight, would be nullified in the sun. Now, in today's episode, we're going to bring up a quandary related to that. And the quandary that the Alter Rebbe is going to bring up today is the fact that if by this logic, if we say that like if we were to shine the rays of the sunlight in the sun, they would cease to exist. And the only reason why we can perceive the rays of sunlight as having a tangible existence is because they're outside of the sun, because it's like those rays of sunlight are shining into something which is not the sun. How does this translate properly into God and into God's radiance in the world? Because if we're saying that there is nothing but God and that nothing has an independent existence other than God, then when we say that here in the world, we experience ourselves as having independent existence, how could this be? Because unlike in the case of the sun, there's the sun and then there's the world, like the earth, that the sun is shining its rays onto. And so thus there's something other than sunness that it can shine those rays onto. When it comes to God, we're saying that there is nothing really truly other than God. So how is it then that we're able to perceive ourselves and feel ourselves to be independent entities? So this is the question of today, and it's actually not going to be answered today. Today we're going to get a little bit into this question, and the Alter Rebbe is going to really get us to really understand and really deepen in our understanding of this question. And then tomorrow we're going to begin to explore some things that we need to know in order to understand this. So let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe brings all of this about. So for context, we are in the middle of chapter 3 of Sha'ar HaYichud v'Emunah, which we began yesterday. And so here we go. So the Alter Rebbe is left off yesterday with this whole idea of how reality is really hanging on a thin thread, so to speak, where the entirety of our reality, the entire of creation, is really totally and fundamentally dependent upon God's speech at every moment and at every time, perpetually. And then the Alter Rebbe begins today, and he says that a good analogy to understand this is by looking at the light of the sun, which shines upon the earth and to all who live here. So as a side note here, I think it's interesting to say, and this is kind of just my own thoughts before we get any further. Maybe I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but I think it's interesting that the Alter Rebbe specifically points to the analogy of the sun, which throughout history, we know that one of the most original idolatrous forces, the things, objects of worship, was in fact the sun. So, and the Rambam talks about this. The Rambam talks about how these luminaries, especially the sun, are messengers of God that God sent down into the world. And the mistake that people made, these idolaters, is that they saw these messengers as being worthy of respect and being worthy of praise and glory. And so there is something about the sun where it's not God. It's most definitely not God. And we know that anybody who worships the sun or gives any kind of praise to the sun is definitely committing idolatry. However, there is something about the sun which does serve as a messenger in a certain sense in terms of our understanding of God. And I think that this Tanya today is going to maybe help us in seeing how that is, because we'll see how through studying the sun, we can understand God's interaction with the world a little bit better. So going back to our text, so again, we're talking about how the sun shines into the earth and those who inhabit it. And this is what we know of as sunlight. And as the light that is coming, the rays of the sun that shine down that come out from the body of the sun. And this is what is perceived to everybody, to anybody who's down here in this world. And everybody who lives here knows, we all know that this sunlight, we're very much aware that this sunlight is coming from the sun itself. And so thus, if somebody were to ask you a question and say, is this sunlight found in the sun itself? Then of course we would say yes, because that's where it's coming from, right? And so if the sun is capable of shining these rays of sun so far down here into our world, of course it must be that these sun rays exist within the body of the sun itself, right? The only thing is that how do these sun rays exist within the body of the sun itself? Within the body of the sun itself, these rays of sunlight are totally nullified in their source. They don't have any existence of their own in relation to the body of the sun, which is their source. It's the source of. So the only way that these rays of sunlight can have a substantial existence of their own is if they're shining outside of the sun itself, like in our world that we inhabit, which are underneath the heavens and on this earth, which is not within the body of the sun. And here on this earth, this is where we can say that these sun rays do have an existence of their own, which is not the case in their source, in their origin. So isn't that interesting that the origin of these sun rays, so they're coming from a specific place. When we look at these beautiful rays of sunlight, let's say you picture like a stained glass window or something like that, and there's many colors, or a prism, all these different types of sunlights, like a rainbow, we look at all these things are all coming from the sun. And they seem to have a really tangible existence when we look at them down here in the world. However, if we were to take these same rays of sunlight that are coming from the sun and shine them back into their source, they would totally disappear. They would lose their entire existence. And if we were to shine these rays inside the body of the sun, we wouldn't call them something at all. They'd actually be considered as if not and nothing. Because truly, in their source, they are not and nothing. Because in this source, the only thing we see is the source, is the body of the sun itself. And these rays of sunlight have no tangible existence of their own at all, or no existence of their own at all in the body of the sun. And now the Alter Rebbe goes on to say that just like we said, that like when we talked about the sunlight in relation to the sun, this is exactly similar to the creation in relation to the godly energy, the godly shefa, the godly influence that comes from the spirit of the mouth of God that comes down here and influences all of us and brings us into existence. Because this godly influence, this godly shefa, which again we talked about in previous episodes, is God's speech, the letters of speech that came from those 10 utterances. This is the source of these creations, and these creations can be thought of as being nothing other than just like light and radiance that comes down from them, from this radiance and from the Spirit of God that is vested within them. And that's bringing them into existence, something from nothing. And thus they too are nullified in their source. Just like we talked about how the light of the sun is nullified in its source and is considered as if not in nothingness, and cannot be called anything at all when it's in its source. So again, in the sun itself, we can't say that there's sunlight and there's rays of sunlight within the sun itself. It's only when there's something apart from the sun, only when it's underneath the sun, when they are not in their source, then we can say that there's different rays of sunlight. So too is it the case when it comes to different created beings, that we can't call them an actual yesh, we can't call them as something at all, but rather we only see them as they're only considered to be a something in relation to our eyes of flesh, because we don't see the origin. We don't see the origin, which is the Spirit of God that brings them into existence, something from nothing at all times. And thus it appears as such to our physical material eyes, to our tangible, these things appear tangible to us. It appears that these things that we see here in the world are actual things, actual independent objects. Just like when we perceive the sunlight, it appears to us that this sunlight is something very real when it's not in its source. But now this is where the analogy breaks down, says the Alter Rebbe. Because in the case of the sun, then the origin is not at all here in this world. Like the sun is not here on earth. The sun is in the sky, and then the earth is the earth. So it's like the sun shines those rays of sunlight down here into the world, into something that's not the sun. And that's how we're able to see these rays of sunlight, which is not the case when it comes to all of the created beings in relation to their source in God's speech. Because we are always in our source. Like it's not like in the case of the sun, that the sunlight is no longer in the sun. We're still in our source. So if we're still in our source, then why do we not get nullified in our source? How is it that we can still, how is it? Like we know that we perceive ourselves as independent entities, independent beings, but how is this the case if we're actually in our source? Why are we not being nullified in the way that sunlight would be nullified if it were to be in its source in the sun? So to be able to understand this, and this is where the Alter Rebbe leaves us off, he says that we need to introduce a new concept, and this is what he'll get to in the next chapter starting tomorrow. So that's it for today. So just in summary again, so the basic idea that we are brought up today is a question. The question is that if we know that in the case of the sun and sunlight, that the only reason why we're able to perceive sunlight as being an independent entity, as being something apart from the sun, is because it shines into something which is not the sun. If the sunlight were to be shown into its origin, which is the sun itself, it would lose all existence. It would no longer have an independent existence. So thus, when we talk about this sunlight as an analogy for created beings in relation to God's speech, which is that which created the entire world, why is it, and continues to create the entire world, why is it that we are not being nullified? Because unlike in the case of the sun and the sunlight, we are still in our source. God's speech is everywhere. It's not, God is continuously bringing the world into existence, something from nothing at all time. There is nothing but God. So if that's the case, why do we perceive ourselves as being something separate? So to answer this question, we're going to begin on a journey tomorrow. And so stay with it, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.